Welcome to Australian basketball history. Let's start with your name, where you're based, and how long you've been playing basketball.
I'm Ned Coten. I've been playing basketball for just about 50 years. I was born in Western Australia, but I now live in Melbourne.
Fantastic. For the purpose of today's interview, is it okay for us to call you Neddo, one of the many nicknames you've picked up along the way?
Yes, I was called Neddo a lot when I was a real player or a fitter player. So that's fine. A few people will remember me by that nickname. It doesn't get used too much now, but a bit of fun.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Neddo. So we're keen today to talk about your early years of basketball, your time in the NBL, your time as President and Chair of Basketball Australia, and importantly, your ongoing passion for Masters basketball. But before we do any of that, we want to fast forward this conversation to August 2023, where you and other Australians donned the green and gold and represented our country in a tournament called FIMBA World Maxiball Championships. Take us to Argentina. What is this tournament that you and others competed in?
It was a great experience. A number of people that are Masters athletes have participated in FIMBA events over the years. FIMBA is a private organisation that's run out of Argentina, coincidentally where this tournament was, and it allows participants from the age of, I think the youngest is 30, or the 30 age group in 5-year intervals, men and women. The oldest group at this tournament I think was over 75s, and it's a really high level. FIMBA has, I believe at the tournament there were around 4,000 participants, so it's a very large participant base. Because of its origins in Argentina, there's a lot of South American teams, but teams from all over the world participate.
Well, how many countries typically attend?
The Brazilians, the Argentinians, of course, teams from Australia, from Europe. There were some teams from the US, not in our category, some Canadian teams, so a real geographic spread right around the world.
So we know that this is the highest calibre of Masters basketball players across the world. Tell us about some of the, I guess, personalities that you bumped into, or some of the qualities of play that you saw whilst you were over there.
Yeah, look, it's interesting. There was some really good players. We, unfortunately, because of my volunteer work, actually, I missed the first game, and I had a long trip from actually the Men's World Cup was being held in the Philippines, and I went to the Congress and then came late, and so I missed the first game, and we actually lost the first 3 games, and then were put into a sort of another, a sort of repechage category of lower teams, not quite as good, and won all of those 3. So I think we finished in the middle of the pack. As many Masters players would know, there were some injuries, and so we had a couple of those, and unfortunately not everybody was fit and healthy, so I think we ended up with 5.5 fit players for the last couple of games, and it was a lot of players that had obviously played at a really good level in their careers and were still fit and healthy enough to get out on the court, and it was great. There was no one of particular note that I recognised from NBA, obviously some NBL players. Robbie Dempster, who I played a lot of basketball with as a kid, was on our team, which was a great experience for me, and but the standard was excellent.
How did the Australian contingent perform?
Really well. There were 3 Australian teams. There was our team. There was another team of we were in over 55s. There was an over 60s and an over 75s. The over 60s, I think, finished 3rd. We finished about 15th of about 25 teams. And the 75s, I'm actually not sure where they finished, but look, the camaraderie, the level of competition was outstanding. It was really good.
So we talked about the calibre of players, but what are the rules of eligibility? If someone's watching this and they say, well, I fancy myself donning the green and gold, how do people get involved?
Look, it's really, and this is, I guess, a philosophy I have about Masters basketball generally. It's about putting yourself forward, and it's about getting out and actually having just being willing to to participate. Teams are, I guess people put their names forward. Teams are selected depending on the number of participants. If there's 10 or 15 in a particular age category, then that would be sort of narrowed down. And FIMBA has representatives in each country. Murray Shields is the representative in Australia. Murray does a great job of pulling all that together, and it's a thankless task because there's a lot of work that has to be done in order to do that. And of course, if people are not put into a particular team or miss out or want to play with friends, there are some politics, as there is in sport everywhere. But it's really, it's a great experience, and I would really commend anyone who's still playing basketball in any category over 30 to really think about participating.
FIMBA actually run 2 tournaments. One is the European Maxiball Championships, which is only slightly smaller than the World Maxiball Championships. When is the next European event, and when is the next World FIMBA Masters Basketball Championships?
There's a world event in Ticino in 2025, which I'm going to participate in. The Euros, I'll be honest with you, George, it's a funny thing. I've been involved in basketball pretty much all my life as an administrator. I tend to focus on the bigger picture, not on the detail, and this is a really good example of that. I've got it in my diary, but I couldn't run it off the top of my head and tell you exactly when it is. But there's a website, there's a lot of information, and I think that they do a really good job of getting out and putting on tournaments, and I know they're thinking about expanding the concept.
Well, without putting you on the spot, it's next month and it's in Pesaro in Italy, and for the first time ever, FIMBA have allowed non-European countries to enter that tournament, and there's a number of players that are going across. While we're on the subject of international masters basketball, it'd be great to talk to you about some volunteer work that you did. You were kind enough to share with us a report about the state of masters basketball around the world. In fact, a very detailed investigation into masters basketball in excess of 30 countries. It's by far the most robust piece of work that any of us in masters basketball has seen, and it's helped us to start to aspire to something better. But as a starting point, perhaps you can talk about the origins of this report and how it came about.
Yeah, thanks, George. I think that for me personally, I've got a lot out of basketball. I grew up in a small country town. I played on a bitumen court with a rubber basketball. I really didn't ever think that I would go anywhere, and basketball for me was a conduit to take me forward. As a result of that, I'm a very big believer in volunteerism. There were a lot of volunteers that helped me along the way, and one of the volunteer aspects that I've been involved with is FIBA, which is the world body for basketball. So FIBA oversee basketball globally. And FIBA for some time have been very conscious of and desirous of getting involved in masters basketball. They're involved at the most, the highest elite levels in the age categories, in men's and women's, but no masters. And so they've recognised that that's an issue. And so this report was put together by myself and some representatives really globally. There were 5 or 6 people from different countries, South America, the US, Europe, were all involved, and we had a number of meetings to pull together the information. And then each of us went out in our own regions to find information about what was happening, what was going on. And the thing that was really interesting to me was that, I always think that Australia is right at the very top of everything that we do in basketball. I'm very proud of that. But in masters basketball, there's actually a lot of others that are outperforming us, and that was one of the things that really became obvious as a result of this report.
Well, perhaps you could take us through some of the key findings of the report, the high watermarks for those countries that were exceptional when it comes to structure and strategy of masters basketball, and then of course where Australia sat in that hierarchy.
Yes, I think that it's a result of focus. So one of the things that I believe in any venture, business, sport, whatever, is getting started and doing things and building over a period of time. What the best countries have done have had a long history of actually developing the masters sport. So probably the best exponent is Brazil. So Brazil have a national competition, it's regionalised, they have different age categories, the local associations all have age categories where players, men and women, can participate. The Brazilian teams, or Brazil as a country, had a number of representatives in every age category at the FIMBA tournament and performed very, very well because they've got a structure. And there are a number of countries in Europe that have a similar circumstance. in Australia, we really don't have any structure. Myths and Legends as one group, and who's done, the organisation's done a lot of work over a long period of time to build Masters basketball. There's other organisations in some of the states and territories around Australia. There's no national structure. There's very sporadic competitions within associations, and that's really at the behest of the local association, with someone sticking up their hand and saying, hey, we should do this. And so I think we've got great opportunity in Australia, but still a long way to go.
So why is that the case? Why is Australia not structured and strategised, given that we've got a great passion for basketball, we've got lots of resources compared to countries, even countries like Brazil? How do you think we are in a position where we've got this gap really in our approach?
Yeah, I think that it's Masters sport in Australia is very strong. So one of my other voluntary roles is with the Confederation of Australian Sport. So I'm currently the president of the Confederation of Australian Sport, and that organisation owns the rights to the Australian Masters Games, which are a very successful event that's been held for a number of years. And so Masters sport generally in Australia has a very high participant rate, but most sports are actually not structured at a local level, and so basketball is exactly the same with that. If you think about the way in which the sport's developed in Australia, it's really been done, I'll use Victoria as an example. The work that Lindsay Gaze and a number of other people did over a long period of time to build stadiums, to start competitions, that started 50 years ago. And now Victoria has, around half of the basketball participant population in Australia, and that's that's a really obvious outcome of doing all this groundwork. And it's not that other states or territories didn't do anything, it's just that Victoria did a lot. And I think it's the same in Masters, where people start to build a home, start to build a competition, start to actually focus on it, then things will come out of that. So I don't think it's something that's intentional. I think that it requires people to get up and say, this is important. And what I'm now seeing it's coming from me, but it's coming from, yourself and many others, is a real focus on trying to make sure that Masters basketball has the same level of focus, the same level of participation as any other form of basketball. And I think that that'll come, and it's better now than it was 2 years ago. It's better 2 years ago than it was 5 years ago. But we still have, we've still got a little way to go. And so I think that I can see a world in which we've got a much better structure, but it's not going to happen like that. It's going to take, a little bit of time, but it requires me and you and, anyone watching this and others to say, hey, I'm going to participate and be part of it.
Yeah, great. Ned, if we keep talking about the solution, do we start lobbying local stadiums for over 50s and over 60s nights, like we've had in Adelaide for some time? Yeah. Or do we go and knock on the doors of Basketball Australia and the state basketball bodies? Where does the work start, do you think?
Look, I think it starts at all of those places. I'm a proponent of, massive action gets things done. I have as I said, a sort of a big picture approach to these things. I tend to sort of, in the things that I do, get out, come up with ideas, get things started, and then hope that there's someone else coming along behind me to pick up the pieces. But I really strongly believe that it's about, the loudest voice, wins. The squeaky hinge gets the oil. That kind of philosophy. And so I think absolutely at an association level, there are some associations that are probably better placed than others to do this, and there is also the factor of court availability. There's a lot of discussion about having Masters competitions during the day when the courts are available, but I'll be 60 this year. I'm still very actively involved in business and loving it, and not intending to change that anytime soon. Now, I would have time to participate during the day, but nights are still better for me. And I think there's that factor. At a national level, Basketball Australia is looking at what they do from a Masters perspective, and I personally believe there's a lot of commercial opportunity. So I think it's not just about doing the right thing, it's actually about the commercial opportunity that the sport has. If you think about the demographics of the people we're talking about, they're at a stage where they've had a career generally, they've got more disposable income, they're able to travel, they want to do those things, and so we've got this combination of people who've got time, people who have got the the financial capacity to participate, and companies that want to attract that audience. I think it's a really good combination of things, and we need to get to a point where we can formalise that on a national scale.
So we've spoken about the work, and there's no shortage of work to be done, either starting at the top or from the ground up. But what's the vision? What would you like to see at the national level for Masters basketball in Australia?
If you think about the way that our national league started, the Women's National Basketball League, the Men's National Basketball League in Australia, they started with a group of people coming together and say, hey, I want to play against the best team from another state. They'd played in their own, there was a state league in every state, and they wanted to do that. And I think what I would like to see is a national league of sorts from a Masters perspective. Now the format would be different. It would be a coming together for a week where representative teams from each of the different states and territories or different clubs could come together and play in a competition. As with general basketball, there are two parts to it. There's the participation element and there's the elite pathway element. And some participants in Masters basketball want to be part of the elite, some just want to play. And so I think you need to cater for both. And so in order for it to be commercially viable, you have to say, okay, well, let's have, in my view, let's have this tournament or get people together. There needs to be an underpinning structure so that people can qualify if they want to be in the elite pathway. But if you just want to turn up and play, you should be able to do that as well. And so I can see a festival or a jamboree where you bring all these together. And we do that in junior basketball, we do that in country basketball. There's no reason we can't do that in Masters basketball as well. And it's certainly one of the things that I'm thinking about with my Confederation of Australian Sport role about how we can really utilise some of those elements. And we've certainly had a number of conversations on that front.
Yeah, great. So the vision's shared. Happy to do the work as well. Just in terms of those two categories, those that want to participate, no shortage of those, and our Masters basketball is growing very, very rapidly. But at the elite level, we recently interviewed both Andrew Parkinson and Darren Lucas. Indeed, when Andrew Parkinson formed the Has-Beens and came up with the name for that organisation, he foresaw a day where there would be a National Masters Basketball League where some of yesterday's heroes could come out and play again against each other. So there's definitely interest at both of those.
And I think that's important because, someone like Parky, what a legend of the game, great guy, had a cult following, and someone that I would pay to go and see Parky play again. I would like to see him out on the court in that kind of competition. But if you think about this commercially, and you think about, okay, who are people that are in the Masters category in Australia or globally that you'd want to go and see? And so one of the people who's not known for basketball is known politically is Barack Obama. He's a basketball nut. Imagine going and playing in a tournament with him. Yeah. Now he would love to do that, and I would love to see an environment where you get people who just love the sport, and there's so many of us participating in a competition like that. So I think it'd be that would be a lot of fun.
Myths and Legends tried unsuccessfully to create the Melbourne Masters of Basketball last year, and we got our timing wrong. It was too close to grand final and too close to the Australian Masters games in Adelaide. But the concept was making sure that we've got a state championships for Masters and hopefully get to a position where we had the same thing for Sydney and for New South Wales and then compete against each other. Do you see that there's an opportunity for something like a National Masters Basketball Week? You mentioned Jamboree. Is that the kind of thing that you envisage?
Yeah, look, I think the first thing I'd say, George, is I don't think that was a failure. I think that was the start of something bigger and better. So it has to start somewhere. And one of the terms that we had a very good friend of mine, a guy called Pete Clark, who worked in our business, and he worked with me actually when I was the president of Basketball Australia as well, on a number of strategic initiatives. And one of his sayings, which I love, is start ugly. just get going, just do things. And so that, to me, that was the starting point. I can certainly envisage that, and what I envisage is that it's not just about the basketball, it's also about the camaraderie, it's about potentially having speakers who can talk about that, talk about that history. For me, some of my heroes growing up were people that were legends of the game. I'd love to see them come and I'd love to be able to hear them speak and talk to them. I think that others would really enjoy that as well. And from a mental health perspective, basketball sport, but basketball in particular is so good because you can play from a very young age to 93, I think, is our oldest player in Australia. To me, it gives you, the opportunity, not just physically but mentally, to continue to participate in, not just in the sport, but it's a participate in life. Keep going, make yourself useful, continue to evolve as you get older. And I think for all of those reasons, it's really important that we think much more seriously about how we can bring it together.
One of the loudest conversations going on in our world at the moment is this conversation around diversity, equity and inclusion. And I'm keen to get your thoughts around that as well. Often when we talk about diversity inclusion, we race into discussions around religion and countries of nationality and sometimes gender, but inclusion has to be about seniors and veterans and those players that once were, or those parents that drove children to the stadium for years and now want to have a run themselves. So I guess what we're talking about here is a much more inclusive basketball environment.
I think that's right, George. If you think about and look, I'm sure, I've really experienced this as I'm getting towards the end of my sort of business career. I'm starting to think about, okay, what do I do next, and how do I stay relevant? Not relevant to others, relevant to myself. And I think that too often people wrap up their sense of self-worth in their career, particularly men. And we've talked about this. How much money you make, what sort of car do you drive, what's your title at work, who are your friends, all of those things become relevant. And as you transition out of your, whatever professional career you've had, you might have been in business, teaching, landscape gardener, whatever it is, when that change comes, that's a difficult transition. And so to me, basketball can be a leveler to that. It's something that keeps you around a group of people who have got similar interests, similar challenges. I've had fantastic conversations away from the basketball court with some of the people I've played with about some of these things. And to me, that's one of the really important things about Masters basketball. It's not just about the physically getting on the court. It's about being part of a tribe. And basketball is my tribe. When I'm on a basketball court or when I'm in a group of basketball people, I don't care if I've never met them before. I feel a kindred spirit because we've got shared experiences. We probably know the same people. We've run up and down the court 1,000 times. We've had the referee boot us out of a game. We've done all of these things. And so to share that experience and know that the person that you're talking to understands things in the same way that you do is just such a powerful thing. And I really get a lot out of that. And I think it's very important in terms of, I'm a big advocate for Masters basketball because of that. It's not just about the physical stuff, it's about the mental, the emotional, and continuing to contribute to society and make sure that you're actually doing something meaningful. Yeah,
well said. You're no longer President and Chair of Basketball Australia, but if your successors are watching this video, what words of encouragement would you have for them around Masters basketball? What recommendations would you make to those people in decision-making positions?
It's being the president of the organisation was for me an incredible honour. I was just, it was something that I never sought it. It sort of came to me, and I always was very thankful that it had come. I laughingly say to people that was none of my revenue and all of my stress. And so the first thing I would say is that it's for anyone in that kind of role. It's a really challenging role. You've got lots of people telling you what to do, giving you their view on the world, and getting upset if you don't implement it in the way that they wanted to. So the first thing I would say is, be a conduit for that, but don't be upset if people have got a view. I think that understanding that the pathway doesn't finish at the elite national level. And so in Australia, the pinnacle of the sport is participating in either our national wheelchair teams or our able-bodied teams at age categories, and then at senior level. That's the pinnacle of the sport. But there's no reason we shouldn't be able to continue that. And what we see, one of the things that I learned early in my career that was really interesting to me was that in US sport, in college basketball, most college basketball players finish their career where they're totally involved in the sport and never play again at any kind of level. They might play some pickup games, but they never play again because there's no pathway for them. If they don't make the NBA, it's like, okay, well, I'm just not going to play basketball anymore. And it's been a little bit the same for Masters basketball in Australia. We play to a certain age and then we go, oh, well, there's nothing else to do, therefore I won't continue to play. And so what I would say to the board and to others involved in those now, who are now carrying the baton, is think about the continuity of those people, and not just from a basketball perspective, from a commercial perspective. These are people that love the sport. They've got access to personal funds, but a lot of them are in leadership positions in business. They're influential in their own ecosystems and environments and communities, and they can contribute a lot. And the sport has got so much to gain from that. There's so many people like us that want to contribute. We increasingly have time. We can coach, we can referee, we can administer, we can help the next generation come through. And I think that that's one of the, probably the most important reason that the sport needs to really embrace Masters basketball. I want people to feel when they get to 50, 60 plus, this is something that I feel part of. I feel part of a community, and I just think that's so important and such a great opportunity for us to really grow our wonderful game.
Well, Neddo, thank you for sharing your vision for Masters basketball in Australia. Your passion comes through, and we're making some noise. I think a movement has commenced, and it'll be important for us to work at all levels to try and make a change. I'm wondering if we could now go back to your earliest basketball memory. Where did it start for you?
I grew up in a small country town in Western Australia called Narrogin, and Narrogin is in the wheat belt. It's inland from Bunbury or Margaret River or the coast that most people know in WA. We had 6 outdoor bitumen basketball courts. We had a rubber basketball, and I played. I think my first game was when I was 12. It was in summer. And I remember I was sitting in a science class and I was in my first year of high school, and I was so excited about playing the first game, and it started raining. And so, we played outdoors, and so the basketball was cancelled, and I was devastated. And so then the next week when we finally got to go out on the court, we ran up and down, and, of course I thought I was wonderful, but I was probably terrible. I had really long hair. I was not in great physical shape. I was actually quite a big kid when I was younger, and basketball was one of the things that helped me, think about my physical fitness. And I was really fortunate. I had a coach, a guy called John Stone, who was went on to be an NBL referee. He was an English teacher at the high school, and he was, my father died when I was very young, so I grew up my mum was a single mum. For that reason, and so he was a really important male role model, and I often think about him and the influence that he had. He was so important to me in those early formative years.
So from living at home with mum and your brother, playing on bitumen courts with your mates, you get a scholarship to go to the Australian Institute of Sport in Canberra, only the single best training facility in the country, with an Olympic coach overseeing your training. How on earth did that move come about? Yeah,
it was quite surreal actually. I went to Perth. As a kid growing up in the country, 40 years ago, I often say to people I had a basketball, I had a football, I had a cricket bat, I had a tennis racket, and I had a bike. And that was my entertainment. And so I played a lot of sport. And in basketball, we would go to what we call country week. And so, 1 week in April or May each year, we'd go up to Perth, we'd play in a weekend tournament. And from that, I was, probably because I was big, not because I was good, I was noticed and invited to train in a state country under 18 team, I think, at the time. and then I quickly got into the state team. And so I played in a national championship, and they had a train-on program after that, and that's where the opportunity, I suppose, came from to be part of the AIS. And I still remember the phone call that I had from Adrian Hurley, or Dr. Adrian Hurley, who was the coach. And I remember that in our little house that we lived in, our housing commission house, that was a green telephone. My mum took the call and said, it's Adrian Hurley, he wants to talk to you. It was quite
an important milestone in your life, and
unbelievable
set the direction for what was to follow, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I didn't realise I was so emotional about it. He it really it really it really changed my life a lot. It was incredible. He offered me a scholarship. And really from there, that was really the start of, me probably believing in myself and really being able to go on and play. And so I went to the, me and another person who was very influential in those early years was a guy called Henry Daigle. And so Henry was the state director of basketball in WA, and Henry took me under his wing, and also Robbie Dempster. So Robbie grew up in Manjum, up another country town. We were coming up to the city to play. We'd stay at Henry's house. And when he found out that we were going across to Canberra, he offered to sell us his 20-year-old VW Beetle car. And it needed a new door and it needed some work done on the engine. And so when we were 17 years old, me and Robbie got in this crappy old car, we put our stuff in the back and we drove across the Nullarbor to go to the Institute of Sport. And how my mother ever let me get in that car is still totally beyond me. It was unbelievable. Of course, we got there and I met, Adrian, Patrick Hunt was the assistant, and both Patrick and Adrian I was still close to. They've helped me post my basketball career as well. And when I was the CEO of the Perth Wildcats in WA, Adrian was the coach. So there was a lot of this shared history that sort of went right through. And so that was just a period of my life where it was a sliding door moment. I could have picked up that phone call and said, look, I'd rather go and play footy. I was a pretty decent footy player, but I just thought, okay, I'm going to, go and do this. And then the whole course of my life changed. I went to another part of the country. I started, studying. I got into the basketball environment, and the rest of my life was, deeply changed by that, that single sliding door moment, really.
Well, before we get on to that next phase of your life, back then at AIS, who are the players that you either played with or competed against? Are any of them still around and playing in Masters basketball, or are they all back at home on the couch?
Yeah, look, it's really interesting, George. I got there, and as you say, I'd gone from literally 1 week I was playing on a bitumen basketball court with a rubber basketball, and that's how I trained. I did all my training there because that was all we had. And then, 2 weeks later, I'm in the best facility in Australia, the Olympic coach, the best junior players in Australia. So Simon Cottrell, Peter Wayne, who was the MVP of the under-20s in one of the years that we played, Mark Dalton, who along with his brother Brad and sister Karen were all Olympians. Mark was an incredible player. Tim Morrissey, who played, again, represented the national team. A guy called Bill Ward, who was from Australia, from Melbourne. And of course Robin, and then another guy, Eric Watterson, who played I think 307 games for the Perth Wildcats. So Watto and Robbie and I were kind of the WA contingent. A guy called Trevor Pugh, who had been there from WA the year before, and was also a great influence on me. So all of these players that I had not met before and really helped elevate my game. Interestingly, there were less Victorian players. So Andrew Gaze was in my, my age group, Nigel Purchase, and they probably would have been much better qualified than me to go to the AIS, but for whatever reason, they probably didn't accept the scholarship, and I got it. And so again, had they decided that they wanted to come, then I probably wouldn't have had that chance. So I felt like I was tall, and I worked incredibly hard. I wasn't particularly skilled, but I just worked as hard as I could, and that's what kind of got me through. And I always felt like I was fortunate to be there, and I wanted to make the most of it, and it played out really well for me.
Neddo, 1984, you make your debut with the Perth Wildcats, 2 years after the club was formed. Of course, an iconic club in Australian basketball history. How did that opportunity come about, and tell us about the club?
When we came back, Robbie and Eric and I from the Institute, the Wildcats just offered us a place. I guess we were, young guns, and I suppose had they thought we had the best chance of being able to go forward. And again, it comes back to what I was saying before about not being that talented but working hard. And my NBL career was pretty basic. I only ever played a few games. I'm still pulling splinters out of my backside from sitting on the bench for so long. So I always say I had the best seat in the house for a lot of games over a long period of time. But what I realised was that I probably wasn't ever going to be a great player and make a lot of money or have a great career in the sport on the court, but I could utilise that opportunity for other things and use that. So I went out of my way to meet as many people as I could to try and take advantage of that. And look, I worked really hard and I wanted to make it, but I just didn't have that inner confidence. I think that when you look at elite athletes, they just have that inner confidence to say, I can do this and I can break through. And for whatever reason, if I look back now, I think that was probably the X factor. It wasn't that I didn't have enough talent. It was actually I just didn't believe in myself enough, and that was something that really spurred me on in the rest of my life.
Memories about first game or first season?
I remember Henry Daigle saying to me, we were playing in front of about 450 people at the old Perry Lakes Basketball Stadium, which remains the best court I've ever played on. I loved that court. It was just fantastic. The spring in the floor and the atmosphere there was amazing. And we were looking around and Henry said, one day basketball will be incredible. Athletes will get paid a lot of money. The stadium will be full. We'll get 10,000 people to games. And I just looked at him and just thought, you're dreaming. And now look he was right. That's what occurred. So what I remember was I felt like we were doing something that we loved, but it just wasn't, we weren't professional, or we weren't, not that we didn't deserve to be there, absolutely felt we deserved to be there, but I just thought, look, this is a bit of a plaything. Like, it's great to be able to do it, but it's not sustainable. And so I was also, despite having said that, I felt like I was really in a great place. I was playing with Mike Ellis, Glenn Ellis, his brother. There was some other great players, and then sort of subsequent to that in later years, James Crawford and Cal Bruton and Alan Black and Steve Davis, these incredible, Trevor Torrance, great players. And I thought, wow, this is pretty cool. I'm on the court with these guys who I really liked personally and learned a lot from, and was just really happy to be there. I was happy to be on the bench, because I just thought, wow, I'm participating in something that I really like. So my NBL career was really as I said, I worked hard, but I never really thought that it would lead to anything significant. But I still embraced it. I still wanted to be part of it. I still thought, wow, if this is all I achieve, then that's pretty cool.
Well, you mentioned Mike Ellis, who of course is on the Australian over 60s team competing in the European Maxiball Championships next month in Pesaro in Italy. In 1984, Mike was club MVP for the second time. Tell us about playing with Mike.
Mike was a real icon in WA basketball for a long time. His father had been the coach, in fact, I think the first coach of the Wildcats, and the whole family, it was a little bit like the Gaze family in Victoria. The Ellis family in Western Australia was just so well known and so well respected, and Mike was just the epitome of that. It just seemed to me like he could do anything on the court. He would get out there, he commanded respect, he took control. He was really just a great guy to be around. And the thing that I found really interesting was Mike would go out there and on the court he'd be, telling where to go and what to do, but he'd be happy to sit down afterwards, do this, do that, encouraging you, slapping you on the back and saying, come on, you can, you're part of this and we need you. And I just love that. I've found generally in basketball that's been the case. There haven't been too many people I've ever played with that I go, they're not a good person. There's a lot of great humans playing our sport, and he's right at the very top.
You've been very reflective and introspective about that team and those players and where you were at that point in time in your evolution. But there was some turmoil around coaching changes around about the same time.
Yeah, there was a period in, I think it was 88 or 89, where Alan Black was coaching the team. Cal Bruton had come to Western Australia. There was a guy called Bob Williams who bought the team from Basketball WA, I think in 1987, 86, 87. And Bob made a massive difference. He was a property developer. He really put the professional touch on the Wildcats. And the Wildcats were really at that time one of the first teams to really take that step. And for a number of years since inception, that we'd been bottom 2 or 3, and then all of a sudden Steve Davis came, I think James Crawford, Cal, and we had this incredible team. And I was again really right on the fringes of that. But that's when it took off. We moved into the 5,000 seat stadium. All of a sudden, being part of the Wildcats was pretty cool. And the vision that Henry Daigle had all those years ago about, I thought, wow, this is actually starting to happen. And so even though I was sitting on the bench, people would write your fan notes, and it was really cool. And I was really interested listening to Darren Lucas talk about his experience, because Darren was an incredible player, really had an amazing career. And I look at someone like that and think, wow, that what must it have been like for someone like that? I thought it was great just sitting on the bench and only sort of participating occasionally in the game and being around it. So. It was an amazing time, and just to see the sport really blossom in that period of time was quite incredible.
3 years later, in 1987, you continue your zigzag across Australia, and you're now in Melbourne playing for the Coburg Giants. Tell us about that move.
I had gone from the Institute and gone back to WA, and I'd started a teaching degree. I did a lot of, I like working with my hands. I've done a lot of building work, and I did a manual arts degree, woodwork, metalwork, teaching. And I did 2 years of that, and then decided I'd like a break over summer. And so I hitchhiked from Narrogin across the Nullarbor to back to Melbourne. And interestingly, I on the first night I went down to Albany, then I got a ride across to Esperance, then up to Norseman, which is the start of the Nullarbor. And I thought, God, I could be here for a couple of days. And I was standing on the corner, and literally the first car that came past was a guy who was a mechanic from Geraldton. He was driving a white Commodore, and he took me all the way into just on the outskirts of Adelaide, and we walked into a roadhouse in Adelaide, or just on the outskirts of Adelaide, and I ran into, standing inside were Todd Viney and Darren Cahill, who had been, who both went on to be very prominent in football and tennis, but had both been tennis players at the Institute of Sport. And so, what a small world. I'm hitchhiking across the Nullarbor, and I bump into these guys and so they took me into Adelaide, and we spent a little bit of time together. When I got to Melbourne, I talked to a couple of people, and I'm not quite sure how it happened, but someone who was involved in the sport knew that I was there, and I got a call from someone at the Coburg Giants, might have been Les Riddle, who was the coach, and said, hey, are you interested in sticking around? And I thought, well, that wasn't part of the plan, but hey, why not? I flew back to WA, I got my car, I drove back across the Nullarbor, and I started training with the Coburg Giants a week later out at the old Coburg Stadium, which is a fantastic fantastic venue. One of the really interesting, probably the most memorable part of the Giants' year was a guy called Jim Foster. So Jim Foster came out from the US. He'd been on both a golf scholarship and a basketball scholarship in college, and the team was owned by Jerry Bednar, who was a furniture entrepreneur. And the story goes that when Jim arrived, Jerry gave him a credit card and said, here's a credit card. I've organised a car for you. My friend is down at on Bell Street, and I've got a car dealership. There's a Commodore waiting for you to pick up. That night, Jim rolled up at the front of Coburg Stadium in a brand new Jag. He opened the boot, he pulled out a brand new golf driver and 12 boxed up golf balls and started hitting golf balls out into the field behind Coburg Stadium. And we came up to him and said, "Jim, what are you doing?" He goes, "Oh, I'm just having a hit before practice, you know." And he'd gone and used the credit card, put a deposit on this Jag, gone and bought the golf clubs. And so at the end of that year, it became, he was wanted on fraud charges. I've never seen Jim Foster since, and there's rumours about where he is, but he was an incredible player. But it was a pretty interesting year being around him.
Willie Simmons and David Graham also part of that lineup.
Yeah, David I knew very well. David had a landscaping business at the time that I actually ended up working with David for a while. Great guy, great player, very intense. Really, was again part of the Australian team. Really, I thought was incredibly talented and really, went a long way in his career. Willie Simmons, really, one of the great American imports in my view. Great person. Very easy to be around. One of the things that I think is incredibly good about Australian basketball is the number of Americans that we've had, particularly Americans. There's been people from other countries, but particularly Americans who have come out here and stayed and been contributors to the basketball community, contributors to the community generally, and really helped to drive the level. And again, it goes back to my view that the current success we're experiencing basketball in Australia is not just about what's happening now. Lots of people have done amazing work. Larry Kesselman with the NBL has done an incredible amount. He's invested a lot of money. But that would not have been possible unless there was this foundation of work that had happened over the last 50 years of people volunteering in stadiums, the person who's collecting money at the front gate, the person who's, running the books, the volunteer coaches, the volunteer referees and bench officials. All of that success has come from that massive groundswell that we've had here for 50 plus years. And the American influence was a big part of that. And Willie was, someone who I really admired and learned a lot from. And he, I've still got a few scars from his elbows, I think.
I think you're right about that, and it doesn't get spoken about often enough. Our first ever interview was with Rolly Holcomb, who's still playing today and indeed was in Argentina with our over 75s team. But we recently spoke to Ian Brown about the history of the Saints as well as the Watson family influence on basketball. And he spoke about the 1956 Olympics and the fact for the first time Aussie boys got to see Bill Russell and an American team. There was only 55 games played, I think 15 teams at the old Melbourne exhibition buildings. But up until that time, we'd only ever seen footy and cricket. Yeah. And of course, seeing that for the first time was a major influence and contributor to what followed. The Harlem Globetrotters movie and the Harlem Globetrotters cartoon series were again ways in which we could access a sport which wasn't Australian and we had no history. And so all of those American influences I think are very important to reflect back on.
Yeah, they are.
Neddo, after a season at the Giants, you head back home to the Wildcats in 1989. This is a rapidly evolving club. What changed in the time that you were away?
I think that Bob Williams really started to do a lot of things with the team and really grow it. And then around that time, Kerry Stokes became involved. So, Kerry was also, he was a partner, I guess, through Channel 7. At the time, he owned the Perth Entertainment Centre where the team eventually played. And he's a incredibly successful businessman and also just a wonderful person. I was fortunate to get to know Kerry reasonably well when I was the CEO of the Wildcats, and I always thought he was just an amazing person to learn from and a great contributor to the sport. I think that the public had embraced the Wildcats. They'd seen success. The team had made the final in 1989 and then lost, and I don't think that's a bad thing because when you win, there's nowhere else to go. But when you get to the pinnacle and you don't quite make it, then there's still a storyline to say, hey, we can go further. And of course, after I left in 1989, 1990, 91, the team wins 2 back-to-back championships. It's not coincidental that after I left they won, I think, but there was some other great players that came into the organisation, and I think that it was. If I look at that rise in particularly the NBL and the WNBL in that period, it was really a combination of the emergence of basketball on television, brands like Reebok were promoting basketball gear as fashion. And so all of the billboards all of a sudden had Reebok basketball shoes on them that were surreptitiously promoting basketball, and that just had not happened before. So it wasn't basketball going out and doing all this advertising, it was other brands and society changing to a culture and to I suppose a philosophy that was more conducive to supporting and growing the sport that we all love. And it was really a seminal time. And in Perth at that time, again, I was a bench player, and I'd walk down the street and people would come up, pat you on the back, say, how you going? And I always felt embarrassed about that, because one of the things about my own career is I've always been, I've never felt that I was a good player. I was okay for my height, and I've stayed fit, so I can still play now. But I was never a great player, and sometimes I get a bit embarrassed about that history. Sure, I was part of NBL teams. I played on a national junior team, but I was not really a participant in those teams. I was I feel like I was an observer. I was looking at others because I wasn't really involved. But I still loved it. I just was able to look in the mirror and go, okay, this is my place. And I wanted it to be different, but it just wasn't. I just didn't have that confidence to sort of, carry it forward. But the experience since I've finished at that level has been incredibly valuable, because it brings credibility. I do understand what it's like to go on the court and train. I do understand what happens. I understand the athletes. I've had that personal experience. And so it was really valuable to me, but just not valuable in the same way that it might have been if I was a decent player, if I was a Darren Lucas or a Parky.
For those that didn't get a chance to see you play in this professional part of your career, what skills did you have, and what skills do you wish you had?
I was a reasonable defensive player, and partly because I didn't want to shoot the ball, because I wasn't that good a shot. Probably the thing that I had was I had tenacity, and I made it my point to work harder than anybody else, and that really carried through into my business career. So that was, people say, you learn a lot of lessons from sport that go into business and life afterwards. Well, that was a lesson for me. Just outwork everybody, and that's really what I did. And I was a good teammate. I was someone who encouraged others. I'd always do the small things, and I recognised that my role was important, but it just wasn't if I'm playing against, if I'm training with James Crawford or Steve Davis or Dan Hickett, who was a great player, a great American import for the Wildcats, and who's still playing and still playing well. Last time I checked, those I just. If I had to go and play hard defence, I'd do that. If I had to pass them the ball, I'd pass them the ball. I did the things that needed to be done. And I think that what that taught me, and particularly post that in leadership positions, is that there are a lot of people in an organisation or in a team that might not feel that they've got a place, or they might not be sure about what their contribution could be. And so recognising that as a leader and understanding what people are getting out, I just wanted to be recognised. I wanted my teammates to like me, and I wanted them to respect me. And when you get that in an organisation, you get great things. And I think that was, at that time, the Wildcats really embraced that. There was a great group of people. They really, there was turmoil. Alan Black was sacked as the coach. Cal Bruton was the GM and came in as the coach at the time. That was a tumultuous time, but lots of great things happen as a result of that. And invariably, when there's pressure, those are the sort of things that happen. And they're all great people. I still keep in touch with all of them. I consider them still to be, certainly great people and good friends. And those friendships for me will always be there because of that history that we shared.
If you think both internationally and really NBA, but also NBL, did you have a greatest of all time or a player that you aspired to be like?
Yeah, look, the player that I loved was Larry Bird, who played for the Boston Celtics. And I loved him from a few different perspectives. I loved the fact that he, slow, can't jump, didn't look like much, looked like he shouldn't be on the court. I could really believe in that. I loved the fact that he was creating history with Magic Johnson, and they went through college, they went through the professional, the NBA. They really remade the NBA. But the reason I loved him so much was that he wanted to pass the ball. He wanted to involve other teammates. One of the things, the most frustrating thing for me on a basketball court is when someone won't pass the ball and they're not in the right position to receive the ball. Passing the ball, there's nothing better on a court than having 5 or 6 passes and getting an open shot or an open layup. There's nothing more frustrating than someone getting it and dribbling it, and just, the first thing they do is dribble the ball. The first thing you need to do is think about, okay, where am I on the court? Where are the opportunities? Should I be dribbling? Should I be shooting? Should I be passing? And invariably, passing just opens up the floor so much more. And he epitomised that. He really changed the game, in my view. And so I wanted to be, of course, I wanted to be a better shooter. Everyone wants to score. But I think looking at the way that he played influenced me to say, okay, pass the ball, get others involved. And so getting other people involved was probably a philosophy that I've learned specifically from watching him and from that era of basketball.
Well, we have a shared GOAT. Larry Bird is also my greatest of all time. He's Parky's greatest of all time, by the way. Yeah. I'd say that I, like you, appreciate his passing ability, and I think he's the greatest passer of all time. Best player you've ever played with and best player you've ever played against?
We played in a University Games Championship in Edmonton in Canada when I was at the Institute of Sport, and again, there's been a lot of circumstances in my basketball career when I felt a bit awkward being part of something, and that was part of, because we were part of the Institute of Sport. It was sort of it felt like, okay, well, you guys are, part of the inner circle, so you automatically qualify for this team. I'm sure there were better players at universities around Australia, but they just didn't get a shot. And Simon Cottrell played on that team, a guy called Chris Appleby, who has been, done an incredible job in journalism in basketball post his career, and some other really good players. And we played against a US team that had some of the, I think that Charles Barkley might have played in that, in that team, and there were certainly some others that were, of that calibre. And I was just amazed that I remember standing on the court and, normally I was at a free throw and I'm in the second block position and I just, the ball goes up and I go for it and I just went backwards and I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe the strength of these guys that were my age, and they were men playing in this league. So playing at that level was incredible. On our Australian junior team, we played in a World Junior Championships in Spain, and we played against Arvydas Sabonis, the great European player, was European Player of the Year when he was 19, and his son's now playing in the NBA, and he was, I played against him for probably 2 minutes in my 2 minutes of game time that I got in that particular game, and he was really, he was amazing. In Australia, it's very difficult to go past Andrew Gaze. I was fortunate to play a lot of basketball or do a lot of training with Andrew. Didn't do much time on the court because he was on the court and I was on the bench a lot. And Andrew was just, is amazing, incredible guy. Mark Dalton, I thought, was a great player. Mark played in the national team, I think, at 19. Tim Morrissey was great. I really admired Robbie Dempster and Eric Watterson because they came through in the same era and from the same circumstances as me. And so one of the sayings I have is, it's not about what you do, it's about what you do with what you've got. And what I had was the same as what Eric and Rob had. We'd just grown up in Western Australia, we'd gone across to the east to participate, and those guys had great NBL careers. And I always really admire that because I just thought that they got everything out of themselves, and they got more out of themselves than I was able to, and that was probably the thing. So even where they might not be, household names, to me they were people who really did everything they could to be at the highest level that they could perform at, and played in the NBL for a number of years.
When you reflect on best coach across Australian basketball history, who do you think earns that title?
Look, I think it's subjective because everyone's got a different experience. For me, the most influential coaches for me were Henry Daigle early on, John Stone, who was my mentor in high school in Narrogin, then Adrian Hurley and Patrick Hunt, who were my two coaches at the Institute of Sport. I thought they were great coaches because they took the time to understand what my strengths and weaknesses were. They encouraged me, and not that others didn't, but those people really stand out. I think it's difficult to say, you know, who the best you know, coach is per se. You know, there's a number that have sort of performed at, you know, coached the Boomers and the Opals and our wheelchair teams and others. And so, you know, I can't look. There's lots. One person I really admire is Sandy Brondello. You know, she's had an incredible playing career. She's now coaching the Liberty in the women's NBA in the US. Great person. Still, she's just got what it takes. That, you know, that woman, and she's just such a wonderful person. I was very fortunate when I was president of Basketball Australia to spend a lot of time with Sandy, and, you know, I love her. I just think she still wants to win just as much now as when she was 15 years old and trying to make it, and I really admire that.
Neddo, perhaps you can tell us about the events that led up to your appointment as President and Chair of Basketball Australia.
I always felt, for the reasons I've outlined, that it was important to make a contribution back to the sport. So when I became the CEO of the Perth Wildcats and the Perth Breakers, who were and at that stage Kerry Stokes owned both teams, and so the Breakers played in the WNBL, the Wildcats played in the NBL. And Kerry was a great owner. It was a little bit of an aside, but I often used to say that Kerry became very emotional about the team. So the way that I describe it, he would walk into our office for a board meeting. He'd open his head, he'd take out his brain and put it in a bucket, and he'd operate with his heart for 2 hours, and then he'd come back out and go back to normal again. And so basketball brought that out in him. I felt that he made a motive to, you know, which is great for me as the CEO because it meant we could get things done. He made emotive decisions around the sport, and that's what you know, makes basketball great. I was asked to go onto the board of Basketball WA in a voluntary capacity as a representative of the Wildcats and the Breakers. And then I came to, from there I left and I went to Adelaide. I actually ran a soccer team in Adelaide for 6 months, and then I came to Melbourne to run the amalgamation of the South East Melbourne Magic and the North Melbourne Giants, the Victoria Titans. And so at that stage I was exposed to Basketball Victoria and to Big V. And so I was asked to go onto the board of Big V. And again, it wasn't something I sought at the time. I was fortunate to be in a position where I could contribute something. I was on the board of Big V, and then I was asked to go onto the board of Basketball Victoria. And at that stage, and I think we're in a much better spot now, although it's not perfect, the relationship between the states and territories and the national body, Basketball Australia, was not great. And so I was asked by Basketball Victoria to go onto the board, or to nominate for the board of Basketball Australia, and a guy called David Reid from Basketball, who was on the Basketball New South Wales board, was asked by Bob Elphinston, who was the president at the time, to represent New South Wales. And so David and I turned up at this meeting. We were sitting right next to each other. We didn't know each other. And I go, "Oh, g'day, you know, I'm Ned, or I'm David, you know, what are you here for? I'm, you know, blah, blah, blah." And so we went onto the board of Basketball Australia at the same time. The president at the time was Scott Derwin, who had previously been the CEO of Basketball Australia. Scott stepped down after a year, and Rob Marcolina, who is a very senior executive and remains a senior executive within Qantas, was appointed as the chair. And Rob was an incredibly good chair. He'd worked for McKinsey or Boston Consulting Group in the US, highly intelligent, amazing person, made great decisions, was collaborative, really interesting. And then after the 2016 Olympics in Rio, his work role changed, and, you know, moved up the ladder, and he had to resign. And so, and he rang me one day and said, "Look, I think you'd be the best person to take over as president." And I was staggered. I thought, well, you know, I just don't have any of that skill set that you've got in that history. But you know, everyone else on the board said the same thing, and, you know, it was kind of like we were all standing in a line, and everybody else stepped back, and I was left standing there. So I won't say I didn't want to do it. I was happy to do it, and I did have, I did have sort of hold some aspiration at some stage to stepping into that role, but it happened very quickly. And in my professional career at that stage, I had a little bit of time, so I really embraced it. I thought, well, this is my opportunity to really give something back to the sport. And one of the things I really believed was that there were a lot of people who had been part of the sport over the years that felt disenfranchised. They'd been sacked they were a coach that had been sacked by a team. They were a player that had finished and not wanted to finish their career, but they had. And there were, literally hundreds of people that I knew. And because I'd spent my whole life in the sport, I'd grown up in a country town. I went to the Institute of Sport. I'd played in the, in the NBL. I'd played in the state league. I'd set up a team in Kalgoorlie in Western Australia in the state league. I knew a lot of people, and I was the kind of person that was, I found it easy to build relationships with people, and I thought my way of contributing is to try and bring this together. And so one of the first things I did was to get an email list. I got all the emails of all the people I could think of, and I went through them. I spent about an hour going through every email I had, and I wrote an email to say, look, I'm going to be emailing you from time to time. Not for any other reason than I want you to understand what's happening in our sport. It's a little bit like Masters. I wanted people to understand, okay, there are things going on that you might not know about. Here's what I'm doing as the president. Here's what our board is trying to do. Here's what the management of the team is trying to do. Here's what we're trying to do collectively. And if you've got information or you've got ideas, send them in. And people said to me, look, Ned, don't do this because people are just going to be inundating you. And my experience has been that actually people don't. Some people will, but they'll only do it if they've got a serious idea or they really have something that they want to contribute. And so the fact that you put yourself out there, people go, okay, I'll at least think about what's happening, and I'll offer some support. And that list ended up with about 1,500 people all over the world. And I did it through the entirety of my chairmanship and presidency. And a lot of people, I think, were thankful for that because it gave them an insight into the sport that perhaps they didn't have before.
You and your board left basketball in Australia in better shape than what you inherited. What do you think your major achievements were?
We realised that there was an opportunity to commercialise some of the assets that we had. So we were leading up to the 2019 World Cup in China, and Anthony Moore, who was the CEO at the time, had the vision to bring the US team out to Australia to play in a game on their way to China, and that was a great insight. That was an incredibly difficult period. People might remember that there were two games played at Marvel Stadium, and the court was raised, and there was seats all over the ground and then up into the grandstand. And it turned out to be, really difficult because people didn't feel like they were getting. They felt like they didn't know what the environment was going to be like, and so there ended up being a lot of people were refunded on tickets, and it was really difficult. We had 50,000 people there, which was a record for Australia. So 100,000 people over 2 nights, but it was fraught with difficulty. But the second night was the first time that the Australian team had ever beaten the US men's team, and so that was a historical moment for Australian basketball, and that was probably the most stressful time of my life. I had people from our sponsors, from government, from the US, all calling me about the issues that they had, and it was very, very intense at that period of time, and it really took a lot for me to just stay on the straight and narrow because there were just so many things happening that we couldn't really control. But I'm really proud about that. I think it was a great achievement, and not so much for me, but for the sport. I think that was, really amazing. We got incredible support from a range of people to do that. I think that working to bring the states and territories together, and what has now happened with the next board and the next lot of leadership is that's now a lot closer. And it's a little bit like I spoke about earlier, the history of volunteerism. The work that we did wasn't necessarily successful, but it formed the foundation. It lifted the foundation a bit for the next group to come in and do something better than us. And I thought that was really important. The other thing that has been really good is that David Reid, who was the vice president or the deputy president to me, took a role on the board of FIBA in Oceania, and has now gone on to the central board of FIBA and is actually the vice president. And at the next start of the next Men's World Cup and the next Congress that FIBA have, it's likely that David will be elected as the president of FIBA globally. And so Australia, every fifth rotation, Oceania, as one of the 5 zones within FIBA, gets the opportunity to put forward a president. The last one was Bob Elphinston, who did an incredible job and helped to really was the driving force behind the House of Basketball that FIBA now occupy in Mee, which is just out of Geneva in Switzerland. And so that was a great thing because David was able to sort of continue and I felt that he got a really great grounding as a result of the work that he did on the on the board, and so I felt really good about that. And probably the last thing was the renewed relationship we built with FIBA. Australia has always performed incredibly well in Olympic Games, in Paralympic Games, at global World Championships and World Cups,
especially our women.
Especially the women, for many years, and our wheelchair teams have done incredibly well. And obviously in Tokyo, the Boomers got the bronze medal for the first time, which was an amazing achievement. And so, despite that, we're a small country of 27 million people. We've performed incredibly well, and historically, people like Bob Elphinston and Lorraine Landon and Dr. Peter Harcourt and others had been involved with FIBA, but there was a lull for a period of time. Scott Derwin was on the board of FIBA in Oceania, but once that finished, we had a period where we didn't really have a connection with FIBA, and FIBA Australia actually put forward a couple of proposals to hold events, and presentations were made to FIBA, and they would say, "Where's Bob? Where's Lorraine? Why aren't they part of this?" Because in their minds, they were that was if it didn't include them, then it wasn't serious. And so we had some work to do. They wanted to hand on the baton to the next group, and so David Reid and myself in particular did a lot of work in trying to regain that trust. And Patrick Hunt was very important in that. He's the president of the Technical Commission for FIBA. Peter Harcourt's the chair of the Medical Commission. So Australians have made an incredible contribution at a global level. And of course, if you think about the NBA and the WNBA, lots of Australians, not just playing, but coaching, in management positions, lots of physios, lots of officials and others. So the Australian influence has really grown, and I feel that we really helped to sort of try and promote that. It was already happening, we just hopefully gave it a little bump to ensure that continues.
In a conversation like this, we end up calling out key personalities in administration, in coaching, and of course some of our most celebrated players. But I know you have very deep felt views about the invisible referees and stadium administrators and coaches and mums and dads that are a big part of the basketball movement. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts on those.
Yeah, I think it's really important. If I think back to my own childhood, the people that really really drove my interest in the sport and really helped me a lot. It was interesting. I outside of basketball, I also played Aussie rules footy, and coincidentally, yesterday I had a phone call with my coach in under 14s, and we won a grand final. He's probably in his late 80s now, not particularly well, but his daughter had contacted me to say, "Hey, look, my dad would love to speak to you," because I was the captain, he was the coach. So we had, even when I was 13 or 14, we had and again, because my dad had died, he was an influence on my life. So again, I was very close to him, and had a great conversation. And he was just a local guy who was a volunteer, had his own kids playing sport, and wanted to give something back. And I had the same thing with John Stone, the basketball, from a basketball perspective. And to think that their influence then allowed me to go and, represent my country, to represent the sport through being the president of the national organisation, none of that would have been possible unless those people were doing something at that level, to start it off. And it's my view that pretty much every athlete that's made it to any sort of level has probably got 50 to 100 people who they could go back and pinpoint and say, these people were influential in my life. And they might not have been trying to do that, but you know, the person who takes the money on the gate, a stadium and an association doesn't operate unless that person's there, because they don't have the money to operate. Unless there's coaches, and not just at the representative level, but at the under 8s, when the kids are running all over the court and they don't know what they're doing. And it doesn't matter if you're not a perfect coach. The fact that you're out there trying to make a contribution, make these kids better, just get them to the next level, is such an important part of Australian basketball. And I travel to the US a lot for business, and I often have conversations, and people ask me in basketball, how come Australia is so strong in basketball? You're a small country, but you've got all these athletes, you perform at the Olympics and Paralympics, and you do so well. And I talk about this volunteerism. And it's not just basketball, it's prevalent in every sport. But if we think about our sport of basketball, you know, the work that you do, the work that I've done, the work of, you know, so many others, and so many in the Myths and Legends group of volunteers, and have done other things, and they might do it in different ways. You know, Nigel Purchase runs, you know, a great basketball coaching business, but he also with, you know, Andy Blitzarves and Ron Bodgetti and a number of Tracy Browning and a few other, run the Pete's Bar Club lunch once a year. That's an incredible contribution to Australian basketball. And so it often goes unheralded. It's people that they're not doing it because they want recognition, they're doing it because they care. And they got something out of the sport. And I've had that conversation with so many people to say, you know, why do you do this? Well, someone did it for me. I want to pass it on to the next person. And I think that's been unbelievably important. And we just would not have the success that we've had at Olympic level, at Paralympic level with our wheelchair and disabled, you know, athletes, at junior levels. We wouldn't have had that ability unless the person who was sitting on the gate at the Mirrabooka Stadium in 1970 did her thing, or the guy that was the coach at you know, Ringwood 20 years ago. Those people are what has made our sport, and I'm incredibly thankful for it. And I think it's important that we recognise that contribution.
Neddo, you're a very busy man. You've got lots of what I describe as a portfolio career. You've got things that you do for reasons of business, and you have ongoing passions around volunteerism. What do you do when you're not playing basketball? Give us an insight into that part of your life.
Somewhat like my basketball career, I've always followed my nose. I did a teaching degree, I've done an MBA, I worked in sport for a long time, and it wasn't something that I chose. It was just the next thing. You know, do you want to come and be the marketing manager for the Wildcats? Okay, I'll do that. That seems like fun. You know, okay. There's the next one is the CEO. I was fortunate to become that. And I was living in Perth. I'd lived in Perth for a long time, and I got a bit bored. I wanted to change, and so I went to Adelaide and ran a soccer team in Adelaide, and then I came to Melbourne, and I'd worked pretty hard in sport for probably 10 years and decided that I wanted to do something else. And so I actually went and bought a school clothing business with a guy called Greg Miller, who was at the time or had previously been the CEO of North Melbourne Footy Club and was known to me through some people in sport. And then I also bought a self-storage business. And I actually bought that out of the Trading Post. I don't know if people remember the old Trading Post, and the movie The Castle made that pretty famous. And so I bought a storage business, and then someone that I knew in basketball, a guy called Mark Cowan, along with Ruffy Gaminda, had been sponsors of the basketball team, the Victoria Titans. And Mark decided he wanted to get into basketball. So he'd actually asked me to go and work in his brand strategy business or brand design business. So, and again, it was just like, okay, it wasn't a conscious thing that I'd chased. It was just, opportunism. And so now I have, I'm involved in a few different businesses in storage. I chair an advisory board for a group called The Contenders, which is a brand strategy and packaging design organisation. In fact, I've just stepped down as the CEO of a business called Engage RM, which is a sports technology business, which I've run for the last 4.5 years, and am an investor in. I've got some other investments in other businesses and things that I look after. I'm the kind of person that likes to be busy. And I've thought a lot about this, and it sort of comes back to my reason for continuing to play basketball. Basketball's been a consistent thing right through my life, and I'll be 60 in a couple of months. I want to continue to work, but I want to continue to have a balance. And I can see I'm not as passionate about being successful as I was. And so I want to be able to sort of take a step back, but I still want to be involved. So quite a range of business activities and quite a range of volunteer activities, and of course basketball has been a central thread in all of that.
Well, this is a very important milestone that I think seniors come to. If you spend a life for men particularly, in accumulation phase, you get to a point where you start making choices. What will I do with the balance of my life? And how will I give back to the sport or to other causes that I feel aligned to? And I think it's the same for women. After I've read the family and children and supported the household and had my career, how do I now take some time back for myself? What will I give back as well? So that's a great thing to be wrestling with. I'm wrestling with the same.
Yeah, and I think it's really important because there is and I've only in the last few weeks stepped down as the CEO of this business I've been running for 4.5 years. And even though it was something that I wanted, I knew it was best for the business, I knew it was best for me, there's still a sense of loss. Because you go, well, I'm not as important as I used to be. I'm not as, maybe people don't see me in the same way. And so I've been surprised actually at how, I wouldn't say it's affected me massively, but I've been surprised that it's affected me in the way that it has. And so I think it's really important for, as you say, for men in particular, but for men and women to really think about, okay, how am I going to make this transition? And I think that's part of the role of Masters Basketball. And again, it comes back to the commercial input. Organisations that, insurance, travel, all of these kind of companies that can actually have a positive influence on the next phase of people's life. And I think that's a really important part of what Masters Basketball can contribute. It's not just about playing, it's about how do I help transition someone's life through this, what can be a really difficult period. It's a time of change. You're probably not as fit as you were, you're not as agile as you were, you might not be mentally quite as astute as you were. But you still, I want to keep doing things. I want to remain relevant. I want to keep having fun. I'm in the best time of my life because I've lived through all those difficult lessons. I've learned the way that I want to live. I'm less caring about what people think, and I'm much more confident in my own sense of worth and well-being. But I might only have a few years left. So how am I going to use those years? And I think that this is something that as a community, I've had great conversations with other people. You and I have had a conversation like this and a number of others in the Myths and Legends group. And when we went to Argentina, that was a big part of it. We'd sit down after a game and we'd talk about these kinds of things, or we'd be sitting around maybe having a beer and just having a chat to people. And we didn't know them particularly well, but because we were part of a tribe, a basketball tribe, and we had shared experience, there was trust. And so when you're in a trusted environment, you can open up a little bit more. And I think that Masters Basketball has got so much to offer in that regard, which is why I feel so passionate about it.
Well, let's look forward to the next couple of tournaments. You're thinking about Bulleen on the 6th and 7th of July, and you're also thinking about the Pan Pacs in November. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a long way further off. The World Masters Games is going to be in Perth in 2029. There hasn't been a lot of announcement. I want to participate in that. I want to. One of the challenges for me personally has been I'm still travelling quite a bit, and so I'm not always in the right spot at the right time. But I want to play in tournaments. And it's a funny thing, you go through phases in your life. There was a phase for probably when I finished working in sport professionally in Melbourne in about 2003, I didn't pick up a basketball for about 5 years. I just didn't want to go near it. I was burnt out. I just didn't want to be around, not that I didn't want to be around the sport, but I just thought I need to have a break. And now I'm back on it's like I'm a kid again. I was like, I want to get out there. I'm still fit enough to do it. I want to participate. And so I think that those tournaments are really important. I also think that there's a bit of a groundswell of people that think similarly to myself that want to participate in those things. And it comes back to what we spoke about earlier of making sure that we if you're part of an association, go and talk to the board or the president or the general manager about saying, look, can we get a over 55s or an over 65s comp going here? Can we do something? Because if we all do that right around the state or around the country, then all of a sudden we start to build the sport.
How long do you plan to keep working and playing basketball, Neddo?
It's a good question. It's one I do ask myself, quite a lot. I'd like to slow down from work and not be, someone said to me many years ago, it's good to get out of the rat race, but some people are rats. And I've got a little bit of rat in me. I enjoy work. I genuinely enjoy work. I'd like to spend more, like I envisage myself being one of my life goals is to get to 100, and at 100 I'd like to be playing basketball. That's how I see it. Now, it probably won't even be walking basketball, it'd be crawling basketball by then for me. But I'd like to continue to participate as a volunteer in the sport, but also as an athlete or a player. I'd like to encourage others to do the same. I'd like to stay involved in business because I think it keeps your mind sharp. So I'm a proponent of doing different things, not just focusing, not just saying, okay, I'm going to stop this and start that. Transition from one thing to another, and you don't have to entirely give up one thing I'm fortunate that my brain works that way. I'm an opportunist. I can see opportunities. I'm not particularly good at the execution and the dotting the I's and crossing the T's, but I'm good at seeing what the landscape holds. And so I don't think there'll ever be a lack of opportunity for me. But I do want to ensure that I can continue to participate and grow. And most importantly, I want to do it with good people I like and trust. That's the thing that really is, motivational. I don't want to play in teams for people that I don't really like being around. I want to have the game, then go and have a beer and be able to have a good conversation with someone. A lot of people separate the segments of their life. This is my work life, this is my home life, this is my sports life. Mine is just one big globulous ball of, there's people that I've met through basketball who I'm in business with, there's people who are in business that have become friends, there's friends who I got into basketball and other things. It's one, I just see it as people, and interaction, and we just interact in different ways. Sometimes it's through basketball, sometimes it's through business, sometimes it's through social activity, and I have different people in all those areas of my life, but I like to bring them together. And so I think that, again, for your mental and emotional health, that's a good thing to do. And I know I keep saying it, but basketball is just such a great mechanism to do that. It's just such a wonderful thing to be part of.
Well, Neddo, thanks. A very heartfelt thanks for your passion around Masters basketball, where you and I have really connected, but otherwise for your contribution to the sport in administrative roles, as well as player. It's been wonderful to spend some time with you today.
Yeah, it's been great, George, and well done to you as well. I think these series, I've watched most of the series. I think they're awesome. I've learned so much about people that I didn't know, and so it's I'm just I feel incredibly lucky to be part of this great ecosystem. I intend to be part of it for as long as I'm standing up on this earth, and it's been a lot of fun.
Fantastic. We'll see you on court and play hard.
Play hard.